Welcome to our talk tonight, When Sparks Fly. And we're really looking forward to hearing from two archaeologists. The event's run by, as always, Galloway Glens, which is a landscape and heritage scheme, which covers the Ken and the Dee catchment areas from Carsthairn down to Castle Douglas and Kirkcudbright. And as I said before, it is a stunning area of landscape with so much rich archaeology hidden away in those hills, which we're going to hear more about tonight. We have two speakers tonight. We are going to start with Lindsay Stirling, who I'm going to just give you a little bit of a background about. Lindsay joined AOC Archaeology Group in Inverness in 2016 and is now a project supervisor. She's worked in various fieldwork and survey projects across Scotland, including surveys on wind farms, forestry and hydro schemes throughout the Highlands and Islands. She has been involved in excavations of sites ranging from prehistoric to post medieval, including roundhouse settlements at Inverness, Rosemarkie, Lairg and Whithorn. Medieval town remains in Inverness and recently ironworking sites at Glenlee, which is why she's joining us tonight. We also have Claire Williamson from Rathmell Architecture, who is going to chair a discussion and questions later on after the speakers have had a chance to talk. So I will pass you over without further ado to Lindsay Sterling.
So hello everybody, and thanks for inviting me to speak here tonight. As you've just been introduced, my name is Lindsay Sterling. I'm a project supervisor with AOC Archaeology, and I normally work up in the Inverness office, but I had a chance to be involved with some of the recent archaeological works at the Glenlee power station in Galloway. So tonight I'm just here to give you a little bit of an overview of the site. So Glenlee is located in Galloway on the east side of Galloway Forest Park. So it's about 4 kilometres from New Galloway and round about 18 kilometres from Balmaggie, which is the other site we'll be hearing a bit about later. So the power station itself is on Court Hill, which is on the southwest side of the Coomburn, which is one of the tributaries to the Water of Ken. An existing power station is located at, for the new development that was happening, it was on the grassy slopes behind this. And there was a small stream and a stand of oak trees in the middle of this area. There were also several known archaeological sites in the surrounding area, which included the possible ironworking site, but there was also locations of 2 possible prehistoric cairns and also several scatters of prehistoric lithics had been found along the floodplains of the river. So historically, the development area that we were looking at, which is roughly in that blue circle you can see on the map there, that was basically a grassy field most of the time. And as you can see, the historic map, this is from 1849, there's nothing really shown there. And the Glenlee power station itself was not built until 1934. And this was a highly significant early hydropower scheme, but the infrastructure for that was mostly contained alongside the road and the river. And so the area of the ironworking site was not really impacted by that. And it was 1974 when the first evidence of the ironworking site was reported by Michael Ansell in Discovery and Excavation Scotland. So basically he recorded that there was a large quantity of iron slag, and a few years later Ordnance Survey surveyors also visited the site and they confirmed that yes, there was lots of iron slag coming out of this burn, but they couldn't really see any significant features. So really these reports of the possible ironworking site were all we had to go on when AOC was called out to start doing evaluation ahead of the new substation. So in November 2020, this is when we first started work on the site. This is roughly what it looked like when we were there. We started to conduct basically an archaeological evaluation, mostly focused on the area where the new substation extension is going to be built. And the aim of the initial fieldwork was really just to locate and assess the nature of this potential ironworking site. Because we only really knew the general location of the site, we decided to set out a grid of test pits at intervals of about 10 meters. And this was really just to try and pinpoint the location. And all of the pits were dug by hand down to the level of natural subsoil. And we were specifically looking out for evidence of this ironworking material that had been reported about. So it's just a map of our grid of test pits there. We had 37 test pits across the new substation footprint. And they were located on both sides of the stream. But what we quickly discovered was that those on the north side of the stream really didn't have any metalworking material at all coming out of any of them. But when we started digging pits on the south side of the stream, several of these pits contained quantities of slag, especially the ones on the slope. We could see pieces of slag in the stream bed as well. And then in particular, two of the test pits 23 and 25, these contained really high concentrations of iron slag. And these were right pretty much at the top of the slope, right underneath this stand of oak trees that was in the center of the site. And both of these pits contained a really dark black deposit below the topsoil. It was, I think one of them was over 1/2 meter deep. It was really, really rich in charcoal and iron slag. And we were also starting to find pieces of burnt clay. So from this, we were able to identify a much more specific area for our investigations of the ironworking site. So next we moved on to the excavation phase. So we started out in March 2021. There was 7 machine dug excavation, about 18 meters squared. And that was really focused once we knew exactly where the site was. So as you can see from the excavation plan here, all of the features really lay within quite a well-defined area of metalworking waste, and pretty much right below the trees, which unfortunately meant we had an awful lot of tree root disturbance on the site. But despite this, the team that were out there, they were able to find that metalworking remains, which is that sort of light grey colour on the map. They then also identified 3 furnace pits, which is the sort of big dark grey circles on the map. And then the red circles are the locations probably of where the actual furnace bases were. And then all the sort of pink and green dots are various pits and postal groups that we had. And we also had a few ditches associated too. So what I'm just going to do for the rest of the talk is just give a brief overview of these features and just some of the early insights we've got on the project. So this is the main ironworking area. And it was a clearly defined spread of like really, really black, dark black silty sand. It contained lots of charcoal, lots of scattered clay fragments. So this deposit lay over the top of pretty much all of the features that were on site. And it's likely that this is just material that's come from the furnace pits and has just been spread around the area after the abandonment of the site. And as you can kind of see from these photos, the material spread down like further below the trees, down to the stream bed as well. But we weren't actually able to excavate in that area at the time. So it was later when they removed tree stumps, we were able to go back and do some monitoring. And as you can see from the size of the tree stump, which looks almost as big amount of disturbance, so we weren't really able to identify any further features, but we could clearly see that this metalworking material did go right the way down the banks into the stream itself. So looking more specifically now at the furnace pits themselves, and as I say, there was 3 separate pits on the site, and these were the main features of the ironworking area. Each pit was about 2 meters by 4.5 meters across. They had quite steep concave sides, and they were basically just filled with more of this same sort of metalworking debris material. So full of charcoal, slag, quite mixed, and just hard to distinguish from the material that had just been spread across the surrounding area. But as the team excavated to the base of these features, they were able to start identifying further features at the bottom, which looked like the actual locations of the furnace bases. So each of the furnace pits appeared to have at least one sort of central circular pit that we reckon was probably where the furnace itself. They contained slag and charcoal and burnt clay, and it was probably a higher concentration of kind of iron-rich slag, and probably more burnt clay came from these parts of the features. So these pits were likely used for the collection of the iron bloom during the smelting process. And then the circular shape that you see would have been where this ceramic chimney-like structure would have sat above. So you can kind of see a very basic diagram on the screen there of, I've kind of tried to piece together what other people have reconstructed roughly. So we reckon that's probably the sort of furnace we're looking at here. But I think the most distinguishing feature of these furnace bases is they're really hard, compact, reddish pink deposits at the base. And this was probably just caused through the extreme heat exposure of the natural subsoil. And you can see also in pit 66, which is the one on the right of that excavation plan, there was possibly even 2 furnace bases within that one pit. And this might suggest that we've had like multiple phases of use of the site, with maybe one furnace being later replaced by another. So there was a couple of groups of pits and post holes associated with the furnace, and this was a little way off to the southwest. And we had 7 poorly preserved pits and post holes. The 4 post holes appeared to be around the edge, possibly forming a small 4-post structure. Would have been about 2 meters by 1 meter across. And then it had these 3 other pits at the center. So one of the pits, I think it'd be that deepest one you can see towards the front of that photograph. That contained more fragments of iron slag, and it also had at the base a kind of fill of charcoal and fire waste, kind of similar to ash type material. So this might well have been a small structure that was used for some sort of metalworking activity or an associated activity to the metalworking. So moving on to look at pit group 2. This pit group was much closer to the furnaces themselves, and were comprised basically 10 post holes, and they appear to form a variety of sort of linear or more possibly curvilinear alignments. And they seem to be sitting between these 2 ditches and just right on the edge of the furnaces. And again, it's possible that these post holes represent another small structure round about the area of metalworking activity. So this could have been something like a windbreak or a small shelter that the people would have used when they were working there. So as you can see from the excavation plan in the bottom left there, you've got a couple of instances where there's 2 post holes that are really quite close together. And again, similar to the case of two furnace bases very close together, this might again suggest different phases of building, possible replacement of the posts in the structure. And it just suggests that there was significant activity happening at this site over possibly a longer period of time. So the final feature that I just want to just talk very briefly about is the 3 curvilinear ditches that you can see in the dark blue colour on the excavation plan. And you can see some of the excavated pictures of them around the sides there. So it's hard to say what these were, but I mean, it definitely looks from the plan that we've kind of got one associated with each of the furnace pits. And they're quite narrow features, and again, just filled with this same metalworking debris, just charcoal, iron slag. And it's likely that these are probably further structural elements related to the furnaces. So they may have been structural slots for upstanding structures, or equally, they could have been for something such as drainage, trying to keep the water away from furnaces. So throughout the excavation, the team took a series of routine bulk soil samples, and they also were collecting any of the finds that were being encountered. And this material at the moment is forming the basis of study for the post-excavation works. And these works are currently ongoing, but it's been really great that the post-excavation team have given us some early photographs of some of the stuff that they've been cleaning, and have also given me a little bit of information that I can share with you ahead of time, as to some insights they're hoping to gain, and maybe some insights that they're already starting to gain from what they're seeing. So the soil samples that were taken on site, these are all going to be processed to recover environmental material, and hopefully also we'll get some good samples for radiocarbon dating. And analysis of this is hopefully going to allow us to put a date towards this ironworking site, and maybe even if we're lucky, it might help us to pick apart if there were different phases of activity on the site. And for instance, it'd be really great to know were all 3 of these furnace pits being used at the same time, or did one replace another, and then the third one replaced both of them. So there's lots of exciting things we can learn from that, and hopefully just get a bit of insight into things like what types of fuel they were using for the furnaces, maybe if there was other activities taking place on the site, or maybe even it might give us a bit of insight into the nature of the surrounding landscape. So the finds recovered from the site were almost entirely iron slag, and also some occasional pieces of burnt clay from the furnace structures themselves. So you can see the photos here show some of the recently washed pieces of slag that the team have been looking at. And you can see that in the bottom left picture, we've got some side patches. So essentially rust, but this confirms that we're definitely dealing with iron-rich slag. So there was definitely significant iron working happening at the site. And one of the specific things the post-excavation team will be looking at is exactly how much iron is still within the slag. And this will really just give us an indication of how effective the smelting process was at this site. So essentially, the less iron they find within the slag means that the process was probably much more efficient. So many of the pieces of slag they're finding as well, we can see that they've got round edges on them. We often call these hearth bases, where they basically form with a lovely kind of rounded base to them, where they formed at the base of the pit. But you can also see the top left picture. We've got a piece of slag that it's got basically burnt clay still attached to it. And this is really just where the slag has formed up against the structure of the furnace itself. So this is a really good indication as to what sort of materials they were using to build these furnaces. And we should, even though we don't really have much evidence of the furnace itself, the team should hopefully be able to get some good insights into that. And within the slag itself, most of it just looks kind of really bubbly like lava. That's because it's so molten when it's being melted. But what we've been finding is there's lots of voids within the slag as well. And this is where it's basically formed around pieces of fuel while it's still being molten. And hopefully from some of these pieces, we might actually be able to get some residues of the specific fuel that was used during the processes. And then finally, in the bottom right picture, I think this is another just really nice little feature that's been picked up by the post-excavation team. So you can see there's a kind of smooth surface on the top of that piece of slag. And this has basically just been caused by the downwards air pressure from the bellows while they were still acting, while the slag was still semi-molten. So it's just a really nice insight into the process there, I think. So just to summarize just now, the results of our excavation definitely seem to, which would have been primarily involved in the activity of smelting iron ore into wrought iron. So bloomery smelting is a process. It was widely used from the Iron Age until the late medieval period in Scotland. So really, until we get more results from the post-excavation team, it's really hard to say what date this site came from. So it could be Iron Age, or it could be medieval, or it could be anywhere in between. But as you can see, then the little diagram I've just put up there again, basically you would have had a sort of a pit at the bottom where you would have put your iron ore, and then the sort of ceramic chimney-like structure, which would have been filled with whatever fuel they were using to feed the fire. And they would have had some sort of into the fire to keep it hot enough. And as the heat increases, then all the impurities melt out of the iron ore and you're left with the iron bloom, which they were then able to shape into whatever tools or things that whatever they were building, really. So yeah, it's really exciting that the team were able to identify possibly 4 furnace bases at the site. I've not done a lot of background research into the site, but from what I gather, it's quite rare to actually, we often find spreads of metalworking material, but to actually find the locations of the furnaces is not so common. So this is quite exciting. And yeah, it will be interesting to see whether or not all of these pits were in use at the same time, or whether we had the replacement of one another over a number of years. But I think regardless, the kind of really large amounts of iron slag that were on this site, I think this would have been a significant metalworking activity area in its time. And it's really nice as well to see just a little insight into some of the other structures that might have been round about the area, like a small structure a little bit away from the furnaces that was used for maybe other metalworking activities. So I think everybody's looking forward to the post-excavation team continuing their work so we can find out more about what was going on there. And just to finish, I want to just say thank you to some people for making this project possible. So our clients at George Leslie and Scottish Energy Networks. Also, I've got thanks to Andy Nicholson at Dumfries and Galloway Council just for his advice. And then also big thanks to the excavation team, who without their hard work, we wouldn't have any of this. And yeah, thanks also to the post-excavation team for giving us some early insight into the results. So thank you. I shall pass over back to Jan, I think.
No. Thank you so much, Lindsay. That was absolutely fascinating. Really, really interesting. And it's lovely to hear about a site that we're geographically so close to as well. So very, very enlightening. I'd like to apologise for the audio a little bit to everyone. We're at the mercy of our internet connections, and obviously we're in different parts of the country at the moment, Scotland. So if you can bear with us, we're going to pass over to our next speaker, who is Louise Turner, and she's senior archaeologist at Rathmel since 2007. Before joining Rathmel, she worked in cultural resource and commercial archaeology following the completion of her PhD at the University of Glasgow in the 1990s. Her PhD focused on the Bronze Age metalwork hoards of Essex and Kent. But these days her work is more wide-ranging, revolving around general finds work and historical building surveys. So we're really, really excited to hear from Louise and see some of her images. She's joining us by audio, and one of our other panelists is showing the PowerPoint.
Hello. Hopefully you can all hear me. My apologies for not joining you earlier. We're talking about a material which of its time is sort of technologically innovative, and unfortunately here in the 21st century, technological innovations seem to be stumbling over themselves. So my apologies to Lindsay, because I was supposed to be giving you a nice short scene setter which was talking about ironworking and the difficulties of ironworking, and my main thrust was actually going to be on the difficulties for archaeologists for actually locating the site of ironworking sites. Because, and I heard the end of the talk and Lindsay made it quite clear, it is extremely unusual to get the amount of information on a metalworking site that she's been getting at the Glenlee site. So this is a truly special site, and I hope you truly appreciated the importance of it from the talk tonight. I'm going to actually move now onto a much smaller site and a more modest site. But again, I'd like to look at the sort of the shared issues, the shared problems, and show you how even something which is much more small scale can yield insights into the technologies as they were operating at the time. So the site I'm talking about is at Balmagee Church Hall, which should be on the first slide if things are going right. Basically, if Claire gives a shout when things are ready, what I was going to look at in the first part was just to talk about the processes of ironworking and the fact there's a difference between the smelting and the smithing, and the fact that slag, which is the usual main product of the ironworking process, is probably one of the least of archaeological finds and something which archaeologists get less excited about than anything. Yet it has the potential to tell us an awful lot of information about the process which was being undertaken, whether it was the smelting of the raw ores or the later smithing of metalwork, or the metal into actual objects. So we have a lot of information available in something which really visually and everything else means nothing. The word slag itself basically means useless and worthless traditionally, which is why it's been applied to other things. And slag is something you really can't do much with. But as Lindsay, I hope, will have been showing you, though I don't think they've undertaken the works yet, but they're on the way forward to understanding it. What they can learn, that's us ready, is it? So anyway, what you can learn is a lot about the ores, the flux, and the fuels used in producing the ironwork. Anyway, Glenlee is a large-scale excavation which has revealed an awful lot of information. The site I'm talking about, which is Balmagee Church Hall, is much more modest in scope. Now, the site is located in the glebe field, which is just southwest of the church at Balmagee, and hopefully you can see them both in the slide. Now, the site where this material was found is actually a scheduled monument. Aerial photographs have revealed crop marks, which suggest that a settlement was located there, potentially in the early medieval period. The dating is probably related to the fact that the church itself goes back to the earlier 12th century. So the current church building is dated 1794. What has also elevated the importance of this site is that it is in the same area as the Galloway hoard. But before you get excited, the slags that I'm going to be talking about today cannot have any association with the Galloway hoard, because this is dear old metal ironworking, which is fairly low key and run of the mill compared to the exotica that were included in the hoard itself. But it would be nice to think that whoever was working here was actually providing the day-to-day items and objects used in the lives of those who were either accumulating the hoard or even burying the hoard. It's a nice thought, but we can't put the two together yet. Anyway, the excavations which took place at Balmagee were undertaken for the replacement of a septic tank by Balmagee Sacred Landscape Trust. If we could have the next slide, Claire, please. The first phase was undertaken in 2019, and the excavator was Andrew Nicholson, the archaeologist for Dumfries and Galloway Council. He excavated several test pits in advance of the replacement of the septic tank. And you should, on the screen, see one of the locations of the test pits towards the top left corner. Now, at this point, a piece of ferrous slag and a burnt deposit were recovered at a depth of 0.8 meters. Now, this was enough to flag up the possibility that pyrotechnic activities, and potentially comprising smelting or smithing, were actually taking place in that particular area. So this was sort of one of the danger signs. And so follow-up works took place a year later in August 2020 with Dr. David Devereux doing the excavations this time. Now, the site plan, which is shown here, shows just how limited these excavations were. If you see the little trench that runs along in the middle. But somehow, and this is an unusual case of archaeologists' luck, this one small trench managed to cut through a deposit which had sufficient qualities of slag present to confirm the earlier hypothesis that some form of metalworking had in fact taken place here. Okay, I'm having problems with my slide presentation at this end. But if we could move on to the next slide, which should be the section, if I remember rightly. Now, here's the thorny question which we need to ask. How on earth are we meant to date this material? We know that it was recovered in an area which was a focus for settlement activity in the past. And we think this settlement may be early medieval in date. But right now, we have to rely entirely on the observations of the archaeologists who originally oversaw these excavations. A little note at this point, unlike Lindsay, who's been sort of overseeing the excavations in themselves, what we've been involved with Balmagee is basically at the post-ex stage. So we're dealing with the slags and the products of the metalworking. So we are entirely reliant at this stage on the work of the archaeologists in the field and their observations. Now, thankfully, if you look at the complexity of this, this section, which is pictured here, you can see that the excavator has taken great pains to recreate the section in enormously detailed accuracy. So he noted, and if you see there's two little orange blobs along it, that these are depictions of fragmentary field drain fragments. So these will be dating to the 19th century. So the fill that overlies the metalworking deposit has to be 19th century, and therefore we're going pre-19th century as we go further down. with the metalwork line at a fairly low depth. So it's inferred from this by the excavators that the ironworking deposit predates the modern period and therefore must have its origins either in the post-medieval or even the medieval period. In either case, this is potentially interesting. Now, if we move forward to the next slide, we have a photograph of the excavation which shows the slag at the end of the trench. Now, the quantity of slag that occurred there suggests that iron smelting or potentially smithing took place. And if it's smelting, that's the primary process, which takes iron ore and produces metal. But we can't be entirely confident of this with this level of information. The working of raw iron into its bloom, which we all have been talking about earlier, produces an awful lot of slag. And one deposit of this slag could come from one event, but potentially when you're smithing iron into objects, you still produce slag, though in lesser quantities. So if you've got a site where iron is being processed on a regular basis into objects and the resulting slags are discarded in the same place over time, this might build up and give us a false impression of what is happening. Now you can see from the scale of the Bloomery excavations that everything is rather small scale and limited. So when you're only being offered a small insight rather than a large scale overview, things are quite difficult to try and interpret. But all is not lost because the slags themselves have the potential to reveal the process that created them. Even a basic visual assessment can give some idea of where the smelting or smithing took place. Smelting in a furnace will produce a higher temperature, and it has the potential to create at least liquid slags, if not molten metal. So these slags might be glassy, black in color with very little iron present, and they may have flow lines showing that the material that was tapped out of the furnace, and I hope you've heard that term from earlier, was actually liquid. Smithing slags, by contrast, tend to be rough and pitted with larger air bubbles, and they tend to be black or dark grey in color, sometimes with a rusty brown tinge. But this is not an infallible subdivision. This is where your input from the archaeometallurgist is invaluable. They can do further analysis and spot the difference between smelting slags and smithing slags. Early ironworking is much less efficient than modern steel production, and sometimes the slags can retain information about the process and the raw ores used for its production. X-ray fluorescence, for example, can reveal details of chemical composition. You might find out, for instance, that high levels of sulfur are present in the slag. This could reflect the use of a high sulfide ores, which is a common characteristic of bog iron, but it could also reflect the use of high sulfide coals as fuel. This is one of the problems with using coal, is that you can quite often get sulfide in it, which creates a brittle iron and a useless object. So how do we tell the difference? Well, I think you'd have to be looking at the fuel ash slags, which occur with the sort of actual metallurgical slags. If they're present and they show a link with coal as opposed to charcoal, you know that they might have been using coal. Otherwise, you would assume that charcoal is being used. So I take it you see from that, if we can have the final slide now, I think it is, that a very small quantity of material does have the potential to tell us quite a lot. Slags are very humble things, and they really aren't much to look at, but there is a lot going on there. And even though the works at Bloomery Church at Hall are much smaller scale than at Glenlee, they have demonstrated that there is significant archaeology present and surviving on that site. And the replacement of a septic tank has allowed us to establish a more precise location and depth of a significant deposit. This in turn can inform our knowledge and understanding for the future and the future management of that site. if we look further afield, we can use the results from these very modest excavations to compare and contrast the results with other sites like Glenlee. Are there any similarities or differences in the production? And can we establish if and how these two sites located in the same general area are related to each other in time and space? So both sites are still at an early stage of investigation, and I'm sure there's interesting conclusions to be drawn in both. And I find it quite exciting to realize how all this information can be learned from studying that very humble and modest of finds, the worthless, useless slag that builds up and creates massive piles in the finds tray. And I think that's my contribution over for the night. It's a much smaller site, but it adds an interesting counterpoint to the complexities that you've been experiencing at Glenlee with Lindsay. Thank you very much for that, and my apologies again for the internet elves who have misbehaved.
Brilliant.
And thank you to Claire. I would actually, just in passing, I'd like to thank the excavators, of course, Andy Nicholson and David Devereux, and the Balmagee Sacred Landscape Trust, who financed the excavations. So thank you all.
Thank you very much, Louise. That was fascinating and really interesting. Really interesting. Thank you for bearing with us from the technology as well. I'm going to pass over to Claire, who's going to take some of the questions. There's been questions in the Q&A box. If anybody else would like to put some questions in the Q&A, please do that, and we'll have a wee discussion linked to the two talks. So, welcome, Claire.
Hi everyone. I'm sorry for my putting up the wrong PowerPoint, but at least it was vaguely in the right area. That was we got there in the end. And Louise calling in from the distance of Loch Winnock, like she's coming in from so questions. I think the first one's for yourself, Lindsay. First couple might be, but we've got from Bradennoch. So have the oaks been chopped down for the substation? So I think that's referring to the three, the big trees that sit right next to the excavation photographs.
Yeah, so basically those three oak trees were right in the middle of the footprint of the new substation extension. So there was just unfortunately no way to work around them at all. So they were all felled, and the stream course itself is being completely diverted. So it's going to be all change in that field.
Everything go. Okay, so Bradennoch again was asking why there. Surely you would smelt near a source of iron ore. So do you know where they were sourcing the iron ore for the site at Glenlee?
Yeah, I don't actually know where they were getting their source of iron from. And I think because we're still very much in our kind of post-excavation phase, we've not really moved into the kind of the research phase, but that's definitely one of the questions that we'll be looking into for hopefully putting together some sort of publication on the site, because it would be really interesting to know if it was coming from a long distance, or was it just up the hill or something.
No, that's good. Yeah, exactly. Louise, have you got any thoughts about the Balmagee site, about sources of iron ore there?
Well, the general rule of thumb is that the iron ore is smelted close to the source of its recovery. So in some cases, you quite often use bog iron, which is basically a form of iron pan, but that is pretty second-rate rubbish iron, and it can produce a high sulfide iron, which, as I'd mentioned briefly, can be brittle. So you can almost envisage earlier sites having this sort of small-scale prospection kind of thing, where they're just sort of they're utilizing local sources and not moving the ores very far. Now, Lindsay's site sounds really rather high-tech in comparison, though I suppose they've still got to work out the time depths and the details. But I would suspect your source is not going to be that far away, because it's easier to smelt close to the site of the mining or quarrying.
Okay, cool, thank you. Yeah, from Richard, I think this is probably for both of you, based maybe on what you know about the site, Lindsay, and Louise, what you know about metalworking in general in the past. So how many workers would have been doing the smelting and working the furnaces? And he was saying that was good to find that number of furnaces, which I think you were saying yourself, Lindsay, was impressive. And would people have travelled to work here or live next to it? So I suppose, yeah, are we looking at something that's like a little family set up here, or are we looking for a much bigger kind of processing at either Glenlee or Balmagee? And in general, I suppose, Louise, what was it usually like in that kind of medieval, post-medieval period?
Well, I'd expect it in that stage to be fairly small scale and local production. So I would expect it to be either one family or a limited number of families involved, and it's probably a part-time job. Now, if you're dealing with specialist areas, so in late medieval, post-medieval times in England, say, you get areas like the Forest of Dean or the Weald in Sussex, Surrey, I can't remember, where they've got a plentiful supply of ore and plentiful supplies of charcoal and the flux as well. And they really have much larger operations there. But again, it's linked very much to families. So families have their own state claims, if you see what I mean, on areas of land and areas of ore. I don't think we've looked too much into it over here. I think we don't quite understand what's happening, but I don't see it being an industrial process, if you see what I mean, in terms of a specialist full-time industry. I think it'll be more part-time or seasonal or whatever. Even at that fairly late stage, it's just producing stuff for local needs.
I think that as well, Lindsay. Is that what you're thinking when it comes to? I know it's early. I'm putting you on the spot.
I mean, personally, this is the first ironworking site I've dealt with, so I'm kind of learning all these things as I go as well. But yeah, I think there would have been a lot of, like, each kind of individual settlement or family probably would have had their own kind of little ironworking area, I would imagine. But I mean, we didn't find any evidence on the site of any sort of other structures around, other than that kind of small, maybe like really small 4-post structure that was quite close by. So it wasn't like we were finding in the field evidence of roundhouses or people's actual homes or anything. So it certainly, this site was not directly next to the settlement. But I mean, we were only really looking at the actual substation footprint. So that's not to say that it wasn't just one field over or something like that. So,
okay, no, you've just done an amazing job there, Lindsay, because that was the next question. From kinds of settlements are close to the site. Oh my God, Lindsay, you're nailing this. Yes, I suppose that's also true for yourself, Louise. And well, now that Lindsay's already preempted that, Louise, do you know anything about Balmagee?
No, only that there is evidence for structures in the form of aerial photographs. All the works at Balmagee have confirmed is that yes, this area is of interest, confirming the importance of the evidence of the aerial photographs. And that's basically all we can say about it at the moment. It would be nice to go and dig it up, but since it's scheduled, I think Historic Environment Scotland would probably say no.
I take it there's a bit of an element with the ironworking. It's a bit like when I've done kind of farming stuff and it's kilns, they're put very much away from the settlement because things can burn down and catch fire. I assume maybe it would be positioned a bit further away if it was the metalworking as well.
I would suspect so. I mean, it does make me wonder actually, if you're going back to the prehistoric stuff, the earliest ironworking takes place well away from settlements. in sort of areas that are almost liminal and ambiguous, you know, like old ritual sites, things and areas where there are dead people buried outside the walls of hill forts. And the theory is it gets domesticated within the Iron Age and drawn into domestic settlements, which then gives you the impression that perhaps there's more control being exerted over it by the people in charge of those settlements. So on the one hand, you will have a close enough proximity for such control to be wielded. But when you're actually dealing with the initial production, if you think about the fact that folk have to move to the iron ore, you do wonder if it's a seasonal thing where they go off, smelt their metal almost as a sort of prospective thing, get the metal they require for the next season, and then bring it back to the settlement where it can then be smithed and worked into the actual object. So that's a theory, but it is entirely a theory.
Okay, cool. We've got Alan asking, how do you think the pits were blown, by hand or water powered? Anyone? To be
right. I'm leaving that one for Lindsay since she's got first.
Well, I mean, it's really difficult to say on this site because the bit of the site that was right next to the stream has just been completely disturbed by those massive trees. So if there was any features there that would have suggested links to the water, we've just not recovered them in any way. But I mean, we definitely saw there was, like, each of these sort of furnace bases had what appeared to be a small pit next to it that was maybe a similar size to the furnace itself. We don't actually know what those pits were for. Could they have been for storing something or for holding something to do with the bellows or raw materials or fuel? I mean, it's another question. I'm just hoping the post-ex team can give us a bit of insight. But I mean, the site was right next to the stream, so I guess it's not out with the realms of possibility that they were making use of that water in some way. But unfortunately, we don't have any direct evidence to say one way or the other at the moment. So,
see, I'm going to play devil's advocate at this point and suggest that when you're dealing with a smaller scale operation, then the investment required to actually build the technology for water powering bellows, etc., is going to be so significant that you'd have to be dealing with a larger operation and a larger scale of production. So I wouldn't be at all surprised if such things were being used later in the post-medieval period in areas of significant iron production, like, again, the Forest of Dean or the Weald. But if you could find it and identify such evidence, then I think you'd probably be able to argue that you are dealing with a larger scale of production, which is probably an interesting thing to look out for, Lindsay.
The challenge has been laid down. Find that work.
You've got a lot more evidence on that one than most of them anyway. So you've got something to work with. You're very lucky.
And then Richard again, he was saying great recording, because it must have been difficult. I think it was quite a lot of hard work on the side, I think. But it was interesting. It was so close to the church. So this one will be for yourself, Louise. Do you think the church might have sponsored the workings? Do you think the church would have been involved in any way?
Well, it's one of these things that's very difficult to say. It is entirely possible, because you're going to need some form of metalwork production in order to build a church and to run a church. But then the whole thing about churches and the long-term history of churches is they tend to accumulate settlements, and your settlement will need iron tools and objects in order to function as well. So it might not be as simple as the church generates the metalworking site, and that's the relationship. It might be a sort of constantly changing one where church needs metal, feeds church, feeds settlement. It's a complex web, and the scale of production may go up as the settlement goes up, anything like that. But unfortunately, we have such a small insight into this site that it is nearly in the realms of science fiction. I'm in skeptical mode tonight, I think. this is what happens when your computers misbehave.
Did that put you out of kilter?
Yes, and I will quantify that by saying, yes, I would suspect there will be some link with that ecclesiastical site and the presence of the metalworking.
Cool. Excellent, thank you. Moira is asking that after you analyse the slags from both sites, are you able to establish if they were sourced from the same site, from the same place? Can you tell that?
It's very difficult with iron ores because they tend to be fairly generic. When you're dealing with something like copper alloy, the copper has very distinctive impurities, and you can often link it with specific areas. So back in the Bronze Age, they have analysis which manages to tell you whether your copper came from Southwest Ireland, say, or Wales. And it can also tell you, when you're analysing copper objects, whether your copper objects are made of virgin copper from those areas or whether it's from recycled objects. Iron isn't usually that easy to source because it's everywhere. You don't really get it in the same limited outcrops. You do get the high sulfide ores, and but they're again still fairly common because it's one of these things that you get with bog iron. So it is difficult to actually pinpoint it to any location.
Well, that's a shame. But lots of other things to tell. No, so I'm going to amalgamate a couple of questions here. One's from Anonymous, I like the name, and the other from MC. So it's asking about the market for the iron produced at Glenlee and Balmagee, and about the scale of the Bloomery workings, small scale, sort of like a village or hamlet group supplying a smith. So we've talked a wee bit about unable to tell about how many people were working it and things, but I suppose maybe it's, do you have any idea about whether it's quite a kind of settled area in the kind of wider landscape around those two sites that could have been getting supplied or have had something to do with this kind of Bloomery sites or furnaces metalworking here? Anyone?
I was going to pass over to Lindsay first because she's got the exciting site.
Well, I think
mine's just a little insight.
I think it's really hard to say at the moment because, like, I don't know yet if we're dealing with an Iron Age site or a medieval site or something in between. So, and I think also being based in the Highlands in Inverness, I don't actually know Galloway very well either. So it's really hard to know what sort of settlement patterns would have been in the wider area round about the site. So I feel like that's a bit of a tame answer to that question, but it's one we'll just have to wait and see with the further research, I think.
No, that was grand, Lindsay, thank you.
I think with Balmagee, I would suspect it's very much for local consumption. I mean, especially if you're dealing with something medieval, post-medieval, again, and I'm going to go back to the dear old Forest of Dean and the Weald. You by this point, you're getting high quality goods produced by specialist producers. And these are the things that are actually going to move further distances for things like, say, cooking pots or cannon, that sort of type of object. Whereas if you're just sort of weaking out chisels, hammers, daggers, etc., I think that's probably the kind of product you're going to be looking at, which is just plowshares. In fact, I'm trying to remember if they have medieval iron-tipped shares or not. They probably, I can't remember. You see, that's me forgetting. But that sort of thing, local objects used for local use, and I think that's how you can envisage it.
Okay, no, thank you. We've also had a question from Jim. A wee brief summary of how does bog iron form, please? I'm going to throw that one at Louise because she threw the last.
Right. Okay,
I'm going to do this for you.
I think it's a particular form of thick iron pan, and it builds up as an interface between various levels of the soil, and it's really quite yuck. And you really, if you're working with this stuff, it's not the best, and it's not particularly broad, but sometimes it's close, and you give it a go. But I think that's how it is. I'm going to say bronze is my thing, but I can't really say. I'm sure it is something to do with local geological conditions and hydrological conditions create this buildup, and you get this sort of disgusting iron oxide layer, which you can grab enough of and then smelt, and it creates something which isn't often very good.
Oh, thank you for that, Louise. That was good of you. Actually, I think this next one's for yourself as well, Louise. It's from Philip, sorry. Would the fact that the site of area appears to be fairly wet, because I think it was quite wet in the photos you were showing, Louise, for Balmagee, would that fact have an impact on the makeup of the slag?
Not really the soil conditions, but definitely if it's wet and producing these bog ores, then potentially you can get the sulfide hit if the metal worker is fortunate enough to have hit a high sulfide ore. So it just depends, and it also depends on how much metal is left in the slag, which when you're dealing with sort of bloomery smelting, you're probably likely to be dealing with working to a point where it creates a sort of semi-molten malleable mass, as opposed to a liquid, which it can be tapped out the furnace. So you're less likely to get rid of all the impurities, which again is going to give you with a lower quality product. And that again is probably more suitable for local use, and folk will not desire it from afar.
Okay, I'm going to merge another couple of questions together. I've got Jim asking what kind of items could be fashioned from the iron, what were its characteristics, was it soft, brittle, and could the items be sharpened? And then I'll also tuck in with that one, is there a way of identifying that something derived from the iron smelted at either of these sites, as in, if so, and importantly, if so, have any iron objects been found? So so what kind of iron objects they were making? Can you tell that they've come from the iron done on this site? And what was the kind of composite? What was it like? Was it soft, brittle? The kind of tools and things that they were making. Well,
again, you've got to look at your date of your site. Neither of us quite know what date our sites are. There is a whole range of tools and utensils, mainly tools. So we're looking at things, knives, chisels, axes. I'm thinking back to Carlingwalk hoard here, which is a Roman hoard, and it gives a good example of the kind of utilitarian stuff you get through the Roman period onward into the medieval period. Locks, keys, dealing probably later in the medieval period, horseshoes, possibly bits, though they might still be using copper alloy, nails for doors, just the sort of stuff you'd get in your hardware shop, basically, but not nice sheet items like the cauldrons and the little camp kettles and things. They're probably more of a specialist product. And no, you're very unlikely to find anything out from your actual iron object, because most of them survive in a state where they are so highly corroded there's very little metal content left. And as I said earlier, iron's pretty generic, and you can't really tell one place from another, if you see what I mean, in terms of all its impurities, etc. But half the time you're just dealing with a bunch of rust held together with a tiny crumb of metal. So, and if you sneeze, it breaks. So it's difficult.
So more appreciation for the archaeologists that are able to get these metal objects out the ground. I'll give you a shout out. So David is asking, any suggestion of any other metals being smelted at any of the sites, or is it just iron that we're looking at, guys?
Just iron for me.
Lindsay?
Yes, as far as I'm aware, so far it's only been iron on this site as well.
This one's for yourself, Lindsay. So right at the start of your presentation, this is from Niall, mentioned Michael Ansell was credited with identifying signs of iron working. What were the signs that he identified?
Yeah, so up on the PowerPoint screen, I basically had two quotes there from the two site visits, and that is literally all we had to go on, those kind of 2 1-sentence. So his bit in Discovery and Excavation Scotland literally just said a large quantity of ironworking residue. So I mean that's very vague in the terms of archaeology. And then the other one, the OS visit, was a tiny bit more specific, and they actually said it was iron slag. So really all we knew was that this stream, people were finding pieces of iron slag washing out on the banks of the stream. So we didn't actually really know at the start of the project where the slag was coming from, what sort of a site it was going to be. So it was very, very minimal information that we had to go on. But I think this just proves that when we do find these even just minimal information, like we shouldn't dismiss them, because we've gone on to find really quite a significant ironworking site just off of a few pieces of iron slag that someone thought to note being washed down a stream. So I think it just shows that don't dismiss things that like that.
And I think on a smaller scale, it's entirely true for the Balmagee site as well, because if it hadn't been for the sharp eyes of Andrew Nicholson spotting one piece of slag and a bit of burnt soil and going, there's something going on, again, you wouldn't have found all the further information.
That's true. Yeah, very true. We've got a couple of comments and one last question. So what I'll do is I'll do the comments first and then give you your last question till somebody else puts them up. But Roger's helping us with about bog iron. Thank you very much, Roger. So he's got chemosynthetic bacteria convert soluble ferrous salts into insoluble ferric salts and use the energy released to live off. Thanks, Roger. That was testing my ability.
That's great. There's a biologist out there or a soil scientist. Thank you.
And Roger's also saying that we could, which is for all of us, watch Orange Gunge video on YouTube to get full details of how bog iron forms. It was the basis of the early American and Russian iron industries. So I will be keeping a note of that, Roger.
Just as an afterthought, there is a point when they start introducing, and I can't remember if it's the cold blast or the hot blast, one of the blast furnaces fairly late on is able to deal with high sulfides. So basically, it's at this point you start using large quantities of coal, because it doesn't matter if it's got sulfides in, and it wouldn't matter if your ore had sulfides in either, because your production process completely removes it and produces a high quality product.
Cool, thank you. And for the last question, which is open to all, although I think it was based on what you were going through the history of the metalworking, Louise, but everyone can have their say, but it's from the Folklore podcast. So is it possibly the case that the older sites were in liminal places because new technology equals supernatural stuff? So in folklore, mills have this sort of thing attached to them early on in their development. Do you think it's that kind of idea? Do you think it had a kind of, mystical?
I think so. I mean, the bronze, the whole society in the Middle and later Bronze Age and the early Bronze Age as well is all about the circulation and exchange of bronze. And iron appears to be developed at a date which is earlier than the end of what we think was the end of the Bronze Age, but iron just doesn't play a role. But there is good evidence in a lot of ethnographic cases of the supernatural role of the smith, and the fact that the smiths can mediate between the gods or the ancestors and the living. So they have this ambiguous position within society. They're revered and yet hated at the same time. And we get this in Celtic mythology a lot. And also, I suppose, with the Greeks even, and the lame god Hephaestus. So the role of the smith is ambiguous, and this could be related to why they appear at first in these liminal places. I came across one case in the Iron Age where they built their furnace in a henge monument up in northeast Scotland. Wow. And the excavator noted how they'd dug up lots, and it was one of the one of the hengiform ones, which is reused for Bronze Age cremation cemeteries. And they'd basically plundered the cemeteries, the cemetery, for the cremated remains of the individuals buried there. And it's possible they were using those cremated remains as the flux, because it's lime rich, in the actual smelting. And the excavator remarked that this was a way of desecrating the dead, but you can turn that on its head and think this is actually a way of using the bones of the ancestors, perhaps to give your metal special powers. And so think on it that way.
That's nice. A bit different. I don't know, Lindsay, have you come across anything or related, or still too early maybe?
Well, as I say, this is the first kind of metalworking site I really dealt with. But I know I've heard of like similar ideas in sort of Viking metalworking in like Scandinavia as well. So I think there's definitely something to it. Kind of, if you think metalworking, it's a process of transformation. So I think it's always going to have a sort of a special significance in some way.
Oh, that's good. Thank you. Thanks very much. I think that's us gone through. Oh, wait a minute. Did I see one? Oh no, one more question came in there. Just spotted that. So is there any connection perhaps with Mockram Fell vitrified fort just southeast of Corsic? Any thoughts? I suppose you don't know the age. That's the only. Yeah, that would be something. Yeah, that would be cool. But yeah, but yes, no. Thanks for putting the thought in there, though, because that's it's good to remember that.
I think it will be, Lindsay. Watch this space, won't it?
Oh, I know, Lindsay. So many things to try and prove in your awesome site. Yes, no. Thanks, everyone. I will pass back to Jan. Thank you, everybody, for your questions. Thanks, Val.
Thank you very much to the audience for those fantastic questions. And Claire, thank you so much for chairing such an interesting discussion. I think there's lots more work to do, and we're really looking forward to seeing what happens next as well. I'd also like to thank my speakers for being wonderful technology swans as we were juggling the sound and the PowerPoints. Fantastic work, thank you. Again, Louise and Lindsay, thank you for giving up your time and your expertise tonight. It was fascinating talk. I think we've had lots of great feedback from that. So I'd like to mention our next event, which is a historical treasure trail in maps. And we have Graham Roberts, who is amazing. He's been archivist for Dumfries and Galloway, and he's wonderful talker about the area, and his expertise remains in the area, which is fantastic. So Graham's going to tell a tale of nabobs, gambling and copper bottoming. So I think that sounds rather unmissable. It's a hybrid event at Balmaclellan Smithy. You can book tickets via Eventbrite, and I think if you want to come to the real event, probably need to book quite soon for that. And the date for that talk is the 26th of April at 7:30. So really looking forward to that. It should be fun. So from Galloway Glens and from the Can You Dig It project and from our speakers, good night and thank you very much for joining us.